Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this ACOSS policy webinar this morning, where we're going to be exploring the serious impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on the lives of international students who have been studying here in Australia. Look, can I firstly acknowledge that we are variously on the lands of First Nations people, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples of Australia, and pay my deep respects to elders past and present. I'm on Gadigal country here in Sydney, and I am very aware that we are delighted that so many of you from across the country have been able to join us this morning, from east to west, from north to south, across all of the various lands of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And so a very respectful acknowledgement of country this morning. Welcome again to the policy webinar series, which we are delighted to have the important sponsorship support from HESTA as our industry super fund, a really important and ongoing supporter of the community sector and ACOSS and many of our state and territory colleagues. Today's instalment we are doing in partnership with a very important partner for us, the Group of 8 universities. We are very aware that the university sector, people working within the university sector, and all the students have been through an extraordinarily difficult time as a result of the COVID-19 impact. And so I really want to thank the Group of 8 for the partnership this morning to bring this webinar event to you. Can I now pass over, before I go further, to introduce you to Danny, who is the ACOSS events organiser, who'll just give you a little bit of housekeeping before we get underway. So stay with us. Over to you, Danny.
Hi everyone, again thank you so much for joining us today. I just wanted to flag that only the speakers and technical support will have video and audio options today, but those watching can participate in the Q&A via the Q&A function down the bottom. If there's a question that you think is particularly important, you can also upvote that by clicking the thumbs up. If you've dialed in by phone and you're having difficulty accessing the Q&A function, send me an email via danny@acoss.org.au. And if you've got any technical issues at all, just mention that in the chat function and I'll be able to help you out. Thanks, Cass.
Thanks, Danny. So just to firstly warmly welcome our great guest speakers today. You'll be hearing presentations from firstly Basina Farbenblom, who's the Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales, Faculty of Law, Millie Mishra, who's Public Relations Officer and Acting Equity Officer for the Council of International Students Australia. A really warm welcome to both of you. We'll then be hearing from Joanne Ligouris, Executive Director, Student and Scholarly Services and Academic Registrar at the University of Melbourne. And finally, last but absolutely not least, from Nadine Liddy, who is the National Manager of Multicultural Youth Advocacy Network. And so we've got a really fantastic and diverse lineup this morning of the different perspectives on this really serious and important issue this morning about the wellbeing of international students here in Australia. Look, as we know, 2020 has presented so many challenges for so many communities, and the current pandemic is leading to a health and economic and social crisis in Australia and around the globe. And COVID-19 is having a huge impact on international students studying here in Australia, and many have been unable to return to Australia to carry out their studies, and many are also really struggling here because they are unable to provide any kind of paid employment at this time. So left without income because of the kinds of job losses that we are now seeing. As you know, to our deep and serious concern, international students have been left ineligible for the Australian government's income support packages as well as wage subsidies. And I want to assure all of those students who are listening in this morning that ACOSS continues to advocate strongly to ensure that income support, so job seeker and special benefit Medicare and JobKeeper are all extended to everybody who's here on temporary visas, including international students. And I hope that today is a further contribution to our advocacy to deliver on that vital outcome at this time. Look, we know, we hear from many of our members at ACOSS, from our charities and those that are involved in food relief, for example, that international students are making up significant and growing proportions of the demands and needs for the basics like food and, of course, trying to keep a roof over your head. And that international students are in the top 5 of the new client groups that are seeking food relief, for example. Look, charities have always been there in crises and will continue to be so. But I know that all of our members, including the charity organisations that are joining us this morning for this webinar, are very clear that we need a systemic solution to provide the support to international students, including the extension of job seeker, special benefit and JobKeeper, as well as Medicare. So I again want to warmly welcome all of you. As I say, I'm delighted that we are partnering this morning with the Group of 8 universities. And so I'd like to hand over to Vicky Thompson, who is Chief Executive Officer of the Group of 8. Thanks, Vicky.
Thank you very much, Cass, and I'm hoping that people can both see and hear me. I'm assuming they can. So thank you very much, Cass, for that introduction, and I too acknowledge the traditional lands of the Kaurna people as the custodians of the Adelaide region, which is where I'm currently located, and pay my respects to their elders past and present and emerging. So as Cass said, the Group of 8 and ACOSS have established a strong partnership with a focus on the experience of student hardship in Australia. And of course, this encompasses all of our students. Today, of course, our focus is on the impact of COVID-19 on international students. And it seems that when it comes to the plight of our international students, to coin a phrase that we're hearing a lot, we're all in this together until we're not. So the Group of 8 educates some 400,000 students. Around 150,000 of them are international. So around 1 in 3 international students studying in Australia are studying at a Group of 8. And we know that roughly 70% of our international students are here in Australia right now. And there has been a lot of focus, quite rightly, on the reopening of the international student market and the reopening of borders. And of course, we are still working with government to make that a reality. But we are very concerned about the welfare of our students who are in the country right now as we go through this pandemic. Our universities have stepped up to the plate. All of us are providing funding to cover things like accommodation, working with Food Bank, who I acknowledge are on this webinar, to provide food support, IT support, interest-free loans, etc. The state and territory governments, and every state and territory government, have stepped up to the plate. So we've got support ranging from one-off hardship payments in South Australia, eligibility for rent relief schemes in Victoria, provision of temporary crisis accommodation and access to legal support in New South Wales, and access to counselling services in Queensland, and a lot more than what I've just mentioned. Internationally, and I think this is also important, it goes to Cass's point about income support, the Canadian government has established the Canada Emergency Response Benefit Fund, and that provides income support for up to 4 months for students who've lost their income, whether it be through employment or self-employment because of COVID-19. In the UK, international students who were in employment before the outbreak of COVID are eligible to participate in their job retention scheme, and that's a scheme where they receive up to 80% of their usual wage. And in New Zealand, just across the ditch, international students who were in employment before the outbreak of COVID-19 are covered by a wage subsidy. And also importantly, they're also eligible for support under a $37.6 million foreign national support program. And then we come to the Australian government. The Australian government has allowed international students access to their superannuation if they've been here for longer than 12 months. So as I said, the Australian government has allowed international students to access their superannuation, but that has been the extent of the support. And of course, it's not just financial support that's needed. A global survey, which was conducted by the OECD of 15 to 24-year-olds in 48 countries, found that the single biggest issue worrying them most is the pandemic's effect on their mental health. So there's a lot to unpack in this very short space of time, and we have 4 fantastic speakers, as Cass said, who really are at the coalface of this issue, be it through their research or, importantly, their lived experience. Because at the end of the day, what we need to do is hear from you about what is happening at the coalface, so that we can be best placed to focus our efforts and focus on the support that we can offer you both at the university level, and I also acknowledge representatives on this webinar from Universities Australia and the Australian Technology Network. So this is a university-wide problem. This is not a group of 8 problem, but we are very fortunate to have the support of working with ACOSS to use this as a vehicle to see what we can do. So there's that support that we can offer at the university level, and then the advocacy work that we can do both with ACOSS and institutionally to our state governments, and then as a group of 8 in ensuring that we can work as hard as we can to get the support that we need for our students. And we certainly support the advocacy work to date undertaken by ACOSS. So with that, and having said that we have these 4 fantastic speakers and their lived experience, it's my great pleasure now to introduce Millie Mishra. So Millie is the current Public Relations Officer and Acting Equity Officer at the Council for International Students Australia. And she's recently graduated with very high distinction in her master's degree focused on international tourism hospitality from James Cook University. Congratulations on that, Millie. A great achievement. And what we're really hoping to hear from, as I said, that sort of lived experience, but also given Millie is at that Council of International Students for Australia organisation as a peak body, they would be often a first point of call, I imagine, for some of the really challenging problems and issues that are confronting our international students. So we need to kind of unpack that and hear from Millie, I think, around what are the sorts of issues that are being raised with you? Where are you directing students to? What's the experience of those students when they are being directed to either their institutions or to their state governments or to their agencies? So on that note, over to you, Millie. Looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Vicky. I hope everyone can hear me properly. I'd like to begin by thanking ACOSS and a group of 8 for giving me the honor to be on this panel with amazing panelists, and everyone for joining us today. I'd quickly pause to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet today, and I would like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. Thank you for the introduction, Vicky. That's pretty much about me. I'd like to tell a little bit about CISA to students who might not be aware about the organization. So the Council of International Students Australia, or also known as CISA, is a national peak student representative organization for international students who are studying postgraduate, undergraduate, private, TAFE, ACOSS, or our own foundation level. CISA was established in July 2010, and we celebrated our 10th anniversary this year. And it was initially, the idea behind this was to form a unified voice for all the international students across Australia. We are a not-for-profit organization and not politically affiliated, which means it gives us the freedom to openly and very freely advance our position on different issues which involve betterment of all international students. So on the next slide, you'll see a very brief on what we do. We primarily advocate and represent international students. We have our presence on lots of different student advisory panel across states and territories, and as well as with the federal government, where the organization has been lobbying in the interest and betterment of international students. Since the outbreak of the coronavirus, there has been a constant uncertainty, and it's paradox saying both things together, but yeah, it's been absolutely uncertain. There have been lots of concerns. There has been immense rise in stress among all, and there are still concerns because there are still locations like Melbourne who are still struggling, and it leaves everyone wondering when are we going to come out of this. So as much as we wish to go back to the good old days when the normal was the normal, this pandemic is a massive part of why we have to learn to adjust and live with the new normal. So yes, CISA has been a main point of contact for a lot of international students. We have been receiving lots of cases. Like the rise of cases have only been great during this pandemic. We used to receive before that as well, but the stories and the cases and the grievances that we have heard during these last couple of months are unimaginable. The struggle, I always say everyone that no two stories of any international students would ever be same. Some things in something common that we all are going through are the mental health impact of it, and also the financial hardships. These are definitely the major issues, and I think these come mostly because of Danny, could you please go to the next slide? Thank you. So these come mostly because of they have lost their jobs. Majority of international students have been involved in hospitality, part-times and hospitality jobs. And because of the pandemic, that was impacted heavily. And the job loss has impacted on the rent and accommodation, and international students have been struggling to meet their everyday needs, something as simple as grocery. So these are issues. So the welfare package proposal, you see, we had proposed this early in March when Australia was trying to deal with it, and we wanted to make sure that no one is left behind. And with kindness, we keep in mind that international students are residents here as well, because we all come together, we all are in this together, and we all have impact on each other's life. Other than that, what we have observed is there have been concerns around visa. There have been rise in wage theft. There has been issues around tuition fees as well, since everything is now online and not in class. Not just that, what I have noticed is the class of 2020 is now going to enter a crashing job market, which just adds up to all these worrying and stress. So I don't want to sound grim here, but it is very challenging time. It's like everything is happening at once, and it can be very tough for international students to deal with, especially when they're away from their loved ones, their family, their friends. So yeah, there have been lots of issues just like that. So we always direct international students towards different government organizations who are established to support international students. Suppose you have issues around maybe your university shutting down, or your issues with retrieving transcripts. There is organization like Tuition Protection Services who are there to ensure you get your transcripts. If you have concerns around your education quality level, then there are TEXA and ASQA who make sure that you get a good level of education. So yeah, CISA has been continuously working to ensure that all students have the support they need to get through these challenging times. If you go on the next slide, you would see that we made a little infographic to show why international students deserve a welfare package as well. And we had listed out reasons like international students are taxpayers too. We have contributed significantly to economy, and we have our own lives and homes here now. We all call Australia our second home. So yeah, I think a lot of international students just want to feel like they're part of it during these times, especially, and not feel excluded. That's a very general sentiment, if I can say, is in the international student community. One thing that I believe we all need to do is stay connected with each other, check in on each other, just give a call to your peers and just ask, are you okay? Are you doing okay? Because at the end, your mental health is an absolute priority. Nothing matters as much as your mental health. So to help students cope with such different worries, we have done different projects, as you can see. These are just to name a few from last few months, but we have had heaps and heaps of projects. We did some meditation session to bring everyone together. We had our 10th national conference last month. with the support of Study NSW, and we had different panelists from different government organizations to discuss on some key topics like we're doing today. We also hosted our online sexual health conference, and we declared an anti-discrimination week. So that's another thing, that the rise in discrimination during this time has been significant as well. And we always encourage everyone to like speak out. If you're going through something like that, speak out, because nobody deserves to be treated differently. And if you think something wrong is happening with you, never ever hesitate, just never. There is always someone out there who would be there to help you out. So I'd also like to highlight that CISA has also been present on Global Reputation Task Force in discussion with Minister Dan Tehan. Just like us, there are other student representative bodies who are constantly working actively to ensure that international students receive what they require and what is essential. On this slide, you would see there are a couple of links which you might find useful. There are lots of links. These are just some things that I wanted to highlight. ESQA, TICSA, TDA, and TPS, these are some of the organizations which would help you around concerns around your university, your tuition fee, your transcripts, your university shutting down. Fair Work and Ombudsman would be the right organization to get in touch if you think there is wage theft or there are workplace exploitation. And Study in Australia is a website where you can find all kind of information around coronavirus and travel and visa, which government has put together for you. So go through those websites, have a look. If you are having any issues, don't hesitate to reach out to them. And if you think you're not confident to reach out to them, you can always drop a text to us, reach out to us, and we'll be here to help you out. I would also like to encourage everyone to, I would also like to encourage everyone to get in touch with your study clusters. They have lots of different programs and support for international students, like graduate programs, maybe internship opportunities, some innovative games and competitions. So when you stay in touch with them, you would get to know what kind of support they're providing, and especially during these times, they would help you upskill and make you job ready. So if you're not sure what is your study cluster, just go to Google and type in study, and after that type in your state name. For example, I'm in Queensland, so I would just search Study Queensland, and it would show you the website and all the programs they're offering. With that, these are just a couple of things that I can think, but further, there are lots of issues. If we go case by case, it's like unimaginable. Maybe if you have any questions, I'd be very happy to answer that to the best of my ability. And with that, I'll hand over to Basina to share her expert view and what she thinks about this. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Millie. And I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting. And I'm calling in from Gadigal land. And I also just want to acknowledge the extraordinary work being done by so many people on this call, whether it's organisations providing support or international students who are helping each other. And a lot of the stories we've heard are about people who are really struggling themselves and yet still helping friends or roommates or others who are struggling even more. So just a lot of respect to everybody doing this very important work under difficult conditions at the moment. So I wanted to just very briefly share some findings of a recent study that we did last year that looks at the problems international students have been having with housing and work that I think lay the foundations for some of the problems that have been exacerbated and got a lot worse now in COVID times, and then look at some of the specific problems international students are having now since COVID, and then very briefly at the end speak a little bit about Australia's obligations to provide support to international students, both moral obligations, but also thinking about our human rights obligations in relation to international students. So last year, my colleague Laurie Berg and I did a survey of over 5,000 international students, which some of you may have participated in, looking at issues around work and housing. And we found that almost 2/3 of international students had worked in a paid job in Australia, among those who'd been here for at least 3 months. So we know that work is really critical to people's financial security in Australia among international students. And that's why the loss of work during COVID has had such a dramatic impact. But we also know that working conditions were poor even before COVID, and people were struggling with the wages they were getting. We found that 1/2 of international students were paid below the basic statutory minimum wage of about $18 an hour. And over 3/4 were paid below the minimum casually hourly wage, which is around $24 an hour. We found 1/4 of international students earning $12 an hour or less in their lowest paid job. So a lot of international students were already financially struggling with these issues at work before COVID hit. We found that this was the case regardless of students' level of education or program of study. So we found that underpayment was actually worse among students in bachelor programs. About 1/3 were getting paid $12 an hour or less. So it wasn't the case that students in longer degree programs or higher degree programs were faring better. This is a problem that's been affecting international students across Australia. And it also affected students across a range of nationalities as well. We identified a range of other problems international students were having at work. And one of the biggest issues with this was that very few international students had sought help for problems at work or complained. And we think that there are a number of barriers that stop international students from complaining about problems at work. One of the most significant barriers is concerns about visa, and in particular issues around the 40-hour work limitation. But we actually found in this study that concerns around visa went even further. And these are really relevant to the context now, where we think that people are facing really difficult problems at work, at work and in other contexts, and not speaking up about them. So we asked international students about what we believe might be common misperceptions that keep people quiet. And we found that the majority of international students believe that if they accept underpayment, they are breaking the law. And that's absolutely not the case. It is the employer's obligation to pay international students properly. But the implications of that are that if international students are being underpaid or are being mistreated at work, they feel that they can't report that or come forward because they feel somehow they've done something wrong and that might affect their visa. And I just wanted to reiterate, I know we've got a lot of international students on the line here, that that's absolutely not the case. We also asked students about issues that they were having with housing. And we found that by far the most common type of first accommodation in Australia is in a share house. About 36% of international students had their first housing in a share house. And that's probably no surprise to most of you, that's where a lot of the problems arise for international students in housing. Often they're subletting, they may not even know the identity of the person who is their landlord. And we've seen a lot of problems around housing coming up now in the context of COVID in particular. One of the really troubling findings in that study was that 82% of international students wrongly believed that their visa could be cancelled if they failed to pay rent or had other tenancy breaches. Again, that's absolutely not the case. Tenancy has nothing to do with visa status. And that's a real problem in the COVID context, where people are having issues with paying rent or eviction or other problems with housing, and perhaps feeling that they can't speak up because it may reflect badly on them or affect their visa in some way. So I think it's really important that for service providers, we get the message across that these things will not affect students' visas, and it's really important that they do come forward and seek help. So now what we've seen in the context of COVID is that many international students were working in the very highly casualised industries where there was really extremely severe job loss, in particular areas like hospitality and retail, but also areas like cleaning, where a lot of international students work. And so we suddenly saw international students lose their primary source of income. But we also saw these students and another cohort of students who were reliant on their families for support losing that support or a lot of it as their families were affected by the global impact of the pandemic, and the financial impact people have suffered in Australia was being suffered similarly by families at home. So particularly those who had both levels of support suddenly found themselves with nothing. As we all know, the government's response was to suggest that international students just leave and go home, and the government excluded them from JobSeeker, JobKeeper and other support packages. We know now that international students didn't go home, that the overwhelming majority stayed for a range of reasons, including barriers to actually getting home for some, no flights, closure of borders. But for most, that wasn't the reason they stayed. They stayed because they had invested so much in studying in Australia at the encouragement of the Australian government, and couldn't risk losing that investment in case they wouldn't be able to get back or would have to discontinue their studies. And so it's completely reasonable that people would have stayed. There really hasn't been an acknowledgement by the government that people didn't go home, and that we need to confront what has happened to this very large cohort of our community who have stayed here. Unfortunately, many international students who lost work have not been able to find other work, and are still struggling across a range of areas. So we've seen financial insecurity obviously being a major issue, with international students unable to pay rent, many fearing homelessness, and issues around share houses in particular, for example, where students were sharing with multiple others. Some of them didn't return with the border closures, and they were left to carry the whole rent, or some of the students who they were sharing with lost their jobs and could no longer contribute to the rent, leading to issues in share houses in particular. Obviously, we have food insecurity issues, also issues around paying for phone credit and internet, which is really linked importantly to mental health. If people can't afford phone credit or internet, they're even more isolated and locked out. And there isn't necessarily support available for that in the same way as there might be, for example, food hampers. People reporting they can't pay for medicine, pay for heating and electricity, and reports of people really entering into problematic debt, whether that's credit card debt or purchases on credit. And the consequences of that are going to be felt for a while still, even after this pandemic, as people are unable to service that debt and it piles up. Students who may have taken out loans for their studies or borrowed money in Australia as well. And I think that's something we need to look at in addition to financial insecurity now, those longer term impacts for people who do carry great debt now. We're seeing real risk factors for increased exploitation and wage theft. Obviously, we've got international students desperate for income, very few jobs, and we're seeing businesses under financial stress, and really the perfect storm there for increased exploitation, unfortunately. We're also seeing, for those who are working, inadequate protective equipment, occupational health and safety issues, and again, the problem of international students being so fearful to come forward means that employers don't necessarily feel the same level of obligation to ensure that they are meeting their responsibilities under Australian law for all workers. Issues around harassment, and particularly again in share house contexts where people just don't have a private and safe space to go. And so issues around family violence, whether it's verbal or sexual harassment among roommates, that we need to be thinking about as well in these private spaces as tension rises and mental health is strained as well in these contexts. We're also seeing rising discrimination, and we covered that in our new survey that we've just closed of over 6,000 temporary migrants on COVID, and we'll be releasing findings from that in a month's time. But discrimination has really stood out as a very significant concern for international students. Obviously, the community sector has stepped up, as have education providers and states, but these are generally one-off payments in most cases, and the need is enormous and it's ongoing. And it's really clear that international students need that level of ongoing financial support. And as we've already heard, Australia is really a global outlier in not providing temporary migrants with access to ongoing wage subsidies like other similar countries. But Australia also has obligations under international human rights law to make sure that every person in Australia, regardless of who they are, where they've come from, why they're here, has a safe and secure place to live, has adequate food, and can meet their basic health and living needs. And these are obligations that are not affected by suggesting that people go home. If people are here, we need to meet those needs under international law. So that we've got a lot of work to do, I think, to continue the advocacy efforts that are being made by ACOSS and so many other groups for ongoing support in the form of JobKeeper, JobSeeker, or special benefits. We need to really highlight the need for enforcement of labour standards as the risks of exploitation increase during this period, and particularly for vulnerable groups like international students. Obviously meet increased mental health needs, and I think we need to have a broader conversation around discrimination, which has not been adequately addressed, and I think contributes to mental health issues that many international students and other temporary migrants are experiencing at the moment. So thanks again to everybody for all the great work being done in this area.
Thanks, Basina, and a warm welcome to everyone this morning. I'm Jo from the University of Melbourne, and I really want to thank ACOSS and the G08 for the invitation for me to speak this morning. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which I stand, and also the University of Melbourne's Parkville campus, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present and emerging. Both Basina and Millie have really outlined, many of the challenges our international students are facing, and their story in Melbourne, at Melbourne University, is no different. So I want to talk briefly about what we're seeing and what our students are experiencing, but also how the university has responded to the situation. And of course, we're in stage 4 lockdown in Melbourne at the moment, which is obviously adding to the uncertainty for our students, and particularly our international students, in terms of what comes next. And of course, levels of anxiety are only being exacerbated. So to begin with, I really want to talk about the experiences of our international students as we've experienced it ourselves, engaging with our student cohorts. We have numbers of students who are offshore at the moment, who are engaging with us virtually, as are the students who are here in Australia, whether it's in Melbourne, regional Victoria, or in other states. So, the impact of COVID obviously felt across the entire student body, but particularly for international students. And I really want to call out commencing students who started with us at the beginning of the year, have joined us in the mid-year intake. New students in particular haven't formed, local networks, and that's been extremely challenging in terms of how they connect in with their peers, how they connect in with the university, how they learn the ropes of how to study at the university as well. So that's been a real adjustment for students, as well as a transition to remote learning as well. I'll also touch on the financial hardship and obviously speak to you about what the University of Melbourne is doing. And so the focus, as I said, has been really an agile one. We've had to respond really quickly as things have developed in Melbourne and in Victoria. And we've worked really closely with the student organisations who have been really active in both advocacy within the university, external to the university, but have been providing us with live, feedback in terms of, what we need to do as an institution to support international students. This is the University of Melbourne's experience. Of course, as Vicky said, every university is responding and supporting their students within their means. So just to begin with mental health and wellbeing, we've heard about, students, feeling isolated. We have students in, shared accommodation, in student accommodation, often, sort of restricted to their rooms given stage 4 restrictions here in Melbourne. So the loss of sort of, connecting in with peers, as I said earlier, and with, academic staff and other members of the university community has been quite challenging. We've done a number of things to respond to this high level of student anxiety and mental health. We've worked really hard, and we began as we, experienced the early phases of COVID-19, the impact of international students who were unable to return to Australia by commencing a program of outreach calls to students, so one-on-one phone conversations. And we really work down the list, starting with the most vulnerable students, so offshore students, first-year international students who would try and transition to university, and really ensuring those one-on-one conversations were about making sure that they had visibility of the services we provide at the university, but making sure that we were connecting them to the right services as well, so they could get the support they needed. And to date, thousands of calls have been made, and we continue in semester 2, and we've extended the program to include student peers who are also join forces with the staff in my area to really reach out to students and have those sort of personal one-on-one conversations. We've also, as many universities have done, and obviously, many other organisations, really sort of lifted our capacity around counselling and psychological services. We've extended after hours support for students, and we've developed significant sort of online self-help guides for students as well, which has proven to be one of the sort of most popular resources on our website today. So students, are seeking and looking for ways in which they can access the services and get the resources they need. So I think that's been really, really critical. We've also done a lot, and again, student organisations are really critical in terms of developing social connections among students, helping students, find friends and connecting them to students across various cohorts and, through their clubs and societies, etc. The university at all levels, whether it's, centrally at the faculty level or department, are running a range of social, activities to really connect students up. And we're actually really fortunate to have launched this year our formal peer-to-peer mentoring program for first-year students. So our international students are certainly benefiting from that. And in semester 2, we're launching our academic advising program, where students will have access to an academic to talk through challenges they might be facing around transition. And we think it's a really critical sort of moment for us to ensure that connection with our academic community. Some of the other things we've had to do, obviously, as every other university in the main has done, is really just sort of pivot all our services to digital to ensure students offshore, students onshore can access those services. So we've managed to essentially run all our services online, which has been a fantastic effort from staff at the university. So students, whether offshore, whether they're in different parts of Australia, can continue to access online support to support their academic progress, whether it's academic skills, careers, course planning, advising, etc., all through online consultations. And of course, we've had to take some practical steps with having a mixed cohort, with some being in Melbourne and others being offshore. We've got students in various time zones. So we've taken sort of practical measures to think about how we schedule classes, when we schedule them, when we schedule exams, to ensure the majority of students can fulfil those requirements at ease, and to really just try to sort of reduce the pressure on them that's already there. I want to talk about financial support and food security, and Basina obviously gave us some great insight to the work that she's doing. Obviously, this is a huge challenge amongst our international cohort. Like other universities, the University of Melbourne has launched what we call the Emergency Support Fund, which to date has supported a significant number of students who are experiencing financial difficulties. And the majority of students who have accessed this scheme have been international students. And it's not only where they've lost income, it's also where their parents have lost income. So many of our students, as we know, are supported by their parents, and obviously the economic fallout globally as a result of COVID has impacted parents' ability to continue to support their students. And we've also provided support for students to transition to online study as well, where they might not have been equipped to do that. So there's been a lot of support through that program. I want to acknowledge we did receive support also from the Victorian government, which allowed us to extend our program and reach more students. And we've also seen, the generosity of our philanthropic community have also contributed to supporting students through the Emergency Support Fund. Vicky mentioned, financial aid, and of course, we provide student loans. We have, financial aid officers who are doing one-on-one consultations with students just around sort of, support for how they budget. So there's an existing services that we've really had to ramp up over the last few months to support those students that may have accessed, emergency support fund but are still in significant need. We've also been working with an NGO, Second Bite, as other universities have, to provide healthy meals to students. And to date, we've distributed, by my estimates, over 10,000 meals to students. And this initiative has been a real university effort. The community's really come together to support this activity through staff, volunteering their time to hand out food packs, as well as students themselves who have volunteered to support these activities as well. Melbourne City Council has also provided food vouchers, and we've been working with some other NGOs around getting food vouchers out to students. And that's been really critical with the restrictions currently in Melbourne and restrictions about distance of travel. So not all students can get to campus to access the food bank. So we've been working with other NGOs to get food vouchers out to those students who live a little further away from the university. I wanted to touch on employability, and of course the university has existing services and they're being accessed by students. We have pivoted those to online. We have a formal program around students at work that has been running at the university for some time that offers students paid internships or casual work. That program continues to run, but I need to acknowledge that there are only so many students that that the program can reach, and so employability obviously remains a key concern for our international students. And I believe universities alone can't solve this challenge. There really does need to be a cross-sector approach to creating opportunities for our students. Whether they're formal internships or other opportunities for students to build capability and skills. It's really important that the sector works with different levels of government, with NGOs and of course with business to determine how we can provide those opportunities to students. So that's really just a snapshot of what we're doing at the University of Melbourne. And as I said earlier, we continue to adapt our response as the situation changes in Melbourne. And so I might stop there and hand over to Nadine. Thanks very much.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for the opportunity to be part of this fabulous panel, and thanks to ACOSS and the group of 8. I'm the National Manager for Maya and the Multicultural Youth Advocacy Network. We're based in Victoria and operate nationally, and I'd like to acknowledge that I'm on Wadawurrung land today in southwestern Victoria. I'm going to focus on a couple of other elements to this discussion. We've heard some great perspectives and presentations from the other speakers with some detail about what's going on for international students on the ground and in the university context. There's a couple of points that I'd like to raise in terms of the diversity of this cohort and what the current context and the current experiences of international students says about social cohesion and where they fit in Australia's migration program, and then make a couple of comments about a way forward in terms of progressing some advocacy to ensure that this group of Australia's people at the moment can be included in the kind of economic and social supports that government is supporting. So just a couple of comments around diversity. And I think this is really important in our advocacy efforts to be very clear about the diverse cohort. And we've heard from the other speakers that point in this direction, but I think it's important to highlight because they are often viewed as a homogenous group, and that's often based on assumptions about who make up the international student cohort in Australia. We've heard from some of the speakers that, of course, there is a cohort within Australia, and many of those did not return home. But there's also a cohort outside of Australia. I think it's important to highlight that There's an age diversity, so a lot of international students are young people, but not entirely. Many are here with family. Others, they have either come here with family, they're raising children here, they've had children here, and they've been here for several years. Obviously, the educational context varies. They're either in the higher ed university or the vet sector. Cultural background and ethnicity are also important factors. Again, I think there's some assumptions about the ethnic cohort within the international student population, and I think it's important to recognise that there are varying circumstances that have led international students to be in Australia studying, and indeed there are some who are minority groups for whom this is a really significant opportunity, and is sometimes an opportunity to escape persecution in particular countries. Their housing circumstances vary. We've heard a little bit from the other speakers about shared housing arrangements, university accommodation in the private sector, in other housing arrangements. Employment circumstances vary and of course have been really significantly impacted by COVID-19 and the economic shocks that we've all experienced. The length of time in Australia, and also the varying community connections and links into varying support arrangements that exist at the community level. All of those factors mean that this isn't a homogenous group, and there is a whole lot of diversity that I think we need to be really cognizant of in our discussions. And some will be feeling the pressures greater than others. I won't reinforce some of those messages around exactly what's going on for this cohort. We've had some really great information, particularly from Millie, who is well and truly at the coalface. But I do want to reinforce that, you know, the social and economic implications of COVID-19 on the lives of international students are such that they are consistent with many others who are on temporary visas. So this is not an uncommon experience for many in Australia who are on temporary visas, and they often are living in precarious circumstances anyway. So the context and the implications of COVID-19 are really magnifying pre-existing experiences and pressures that this cohort experience, partly because of the status of being on a temporary visa. Some of those things I think that are important to highlight that have been touched on a little bit by other speakers, but a reluctance to seek government support and understanding of rights within the Australian context as temporary visa holders, and a reluctance to seek support because of fear of the impact on their visas. That's not uncommon, and again in the current context it's particularly pertinent. A couple of other things I'd like to say about the mental health implications. Certainly separation from family and significant others, again, is not new in the context for international students. Often there's a great sense of loneliness and isolation, but in the current context, of course, those economic and social and public health the context of the crisis that we're all experiencing means that there are additional pressures for this group of young people, and they are also carrying those pressures of fear of the safety and security of loved ones elsewhere, so overseas, and that is of course much more acute in the current context, as well as economic stresses that families and significant others may be experiencing outside of Australia. I think another important thing to say that we've heard certainly through young people and others in our networks is, even though there is some good mental health support available, it isn't always accessible to this group of young people. So we're hearing a lot from young people that there are some accessibility barriers in mainstream mental health services, and there's quite a bit of work to do to ensure that some of those gaps in culturally appropriate service delivery models are addressed. And we've also heard from other speakers about experiences of racism and discrimination, and that being students certainly reporting a clear increase in that. And we know that experiences of racism and discrimination have a really significant and long-term impact on people's mental health and their sense of inclusion and belonging in Australian society. A couple of comments I'd like to make about the public perception of international students in the context of the pandemic, the crisis that we are in, and these certainly contribute to feelings of social and economic isolation and exclusion for students. You know, they're often seen as a burden. They're often seen as not part of the Australian community, so not necessarily deserving of income or government, federal government support. We know that a number of state governments, if not all, have certainly stepped up to provide some income support and relief packages, which is great. But as a broader narrative, you know, this label as being temporary migrants is really significant, and there is an impact on a negative perception of belonging within the Australian community, and who is deserving and who isn't. And students that we've been in touch with have certainly spoken very articulately about that and the impact that has on their mental health. Basina spoke, I thought, very articulately around some of the reasons that students have not returned home. Again, that's been a very clear narrative from government that students should be able to return home. Actually, it's more complex than that, but certainly, as Basina shared, some of those reasons are not particularly complex, but they certainly haven't been acknowledged by the federal government, and I don't think they're well understood by the broader community. You know, I think it remains an expectation based partly on a lack of understanding that this group ought to be returning home. But there's some limited understanding of the realities of that, and therefore that they are deserving of support as residents of Australia at this time. And we know that, you know, the perception of international students in Australia's migration and multicultural landscape isn't always seen through a human rights lens, and Basina talked about the clear international human rights obligations that exist in the current context, and they're not being met. But I think what is missing in the narrative is a human rights lens, or one that takes a more holistic perspective of students' lives and acknowledges the broader contributions they make to Australian society. Again, in some of the conversations we've had with international students, they talk about being viewed through a lens of economic contributions only. But actually, they build lives here, they are part of the community. Their contributions are much broader than an economic one. They make social and cultural contributions to Australian society that are long-term contributions, and many international students go on to live in Australia for many, many years and become part of our skilled migration program. And I think there's some questions there about what this reflects about more entrenched systemic or structural racism in the Australian context. And a couple of last comments just around social cohesion. Again, talking to some of our partners around the country, certainly some local and state governments are very cognizant about the impact on social cohesion of the marginalised nature of the international student cohort at the moment. You know, and they are working to mitigate or prevent further marginalisation and the impact that this has on social cohesion in our communities. And I think that's really important to acknowledge some of the good work that's happening in that space, because it is an important reality. And I think at a national level, you know, how do we support all of those living in Australia, regardless of visa status, in this time of acute economic and public health crisis? You know, there are and will continue to be significant social cohesion implications, and how do we best mitigate those now? So a couple of concluding comments in terms of what's needed and in relation to some advocacy. I mean, I think certainly what we need is a consistent and a national approach to ensure that this group aren't further marginalised, in particular from the federal government. And I think we need better and more nationally consistent support around mental health, and of course the obvious gap, longer term and more secure income support that would address some of the housing and food security issues. And in terms of advocacy, you know, I think we certainly need to continue engaging with the federal government to ensure that the specific context of international students is well understood, and the diversity of the cohort and the very particular experiences of individuals and groups within this broader cohort, and the particularly precarious circumstances that they're living in are best understood, including the impact on social cohesion in Australia and Australia's reputation as a welcoming country, and in the longer term, that it continues to be a viable or an attractive destination for international students. And I think that speaks to experiences of racism and discrimination that have been on the rise in the current context. I think we need to continue to undertake research, and we've heard from a couple of the other speakers about some of the research in this area, and I know that there's some really important research happening in various states and territories, and we need to share those findings as an important evidence base. I think we also need to be looking at coordinated efforts for national advocacy and bringing together diverse sectors and voices like we have here today, coordinated efforts that can strengthen our work in this regard. And of course, as we are all acutely aware, we need some better systemic solutions rather than this reliance on charities and emergency short-term relief. Thank you.
Thanks, Nadine, and to thank all of you, Millie and Joe and Basina, for the really important contributions, and I think of you know, from your various different perspectives, painting both a picture of real grit and determination from all of you and people, so many people across the community who are really trying to look out for and support the international students who are affected by this. And I just again want to acknowledge, you know, this must be keeping many of you awake at night a lot. And all of the layers of support and pressure on those that are in these various roles, trying to provide the support at every level, and also the advocacy. And so I just want to kick off again by committing that we are very determined to pursue this advocacy as ACOSS, and out of this event today, again, just any kind of partnerships or moments that we have to really try and cut through with this. I think, you know, as Nadine, you highlighted at the end and others have touched on, we don't underestimate that underneath this is cultural issues associated with racism, and the approach that's being taken here, where we're very concerned about who is being seen as important and who is seriously being ignored and left behind. I wondered if I can, and Vicky will also chip in here, because we are keen, there's quite a lot of questions that have come through, for your comments on how we compare with approaches in some other comparable countries on this, and is there anything that we can use in our collective advocacy to highlight what we need to do seriously differently here? Anybody want to take that?
Yeah, we've actually put together a document that I can share that compares Australia's response with those of other countries. And I think a lot of other countries, so for example, the UK, Ireland, Canada, New Zealand, have taken the approach that temporary migrants, including international students, are very much part of our community. If they have lost work, we need to support them in the same way we are supporting residents and nationals. And some of them have minimum requirements in terms of how long people have been working or how long they've been in Australia. But I think there's a clear recognition that for those who have been here for some minimum amount of time or been working for some amount of time, their needs are the same as citizens and residents, and that they are not being treated any differently because of their migration status. So I think there are some really good examples there that we can draw on in terms of a very different approach to temporary migrants in other similar countries to Australia.
And if I can just add there, Basina's quite right, and we've looked at the same group of countries, and there's a lot of work that's been going on, just not in terms of the sort of one-off emergency support, but also in issues around visas and relaxing visas and post-study work rights, etc. But it really does come down to this issue, I think, that I really was interested in and wanted to unpick a bit more with, that Nadine made, about the perception of international students and the perception that they are seen in an economic context. And I noted, Millie, when you actually, in that presentation, you made the very valid point that, we're taxpayers and we contribute to the economy. And look, universities, and there's many of us sitting on this this webinar, we do talk about it in that context. And I certainly recognise that we perhaps play a bit of a role in that economic narrative. And, we've really had to, more so than now, than ever before in this COVID context, because it's the language the government understands. It's not getting us very far, but this really challenging time that all of our universities are in, because of the loss of international student revenue. Now, we can have another debate about how and why that's happened. I would assert it's because government has started to walk away from funding our universities, but that's I guess a whole nother issue to unpick. But this issue of perception, I guess my questions are to you, Basina, if in any of your research, have you looked at that perception issue in other countries? And whether, given those countries have done fantastic things that we're not doing, what is the stumbling block for us? Is it that sort of, I think Nadine, you said sort of this inherent racism that underlies that? And Millie, do you get any, sorry, I'm asking questions now, but Millie, do you actually see it in that context as well? And are you getting feedback from students that you're feeling undervalued in that context?
Millie, go ahead.
First, and then Millie, thanks.
So we haven't looked at it specifically in the context of this support, but I think that the conversation in Australia around international students has been very much around economic contribution, and I think that has been very damaging for the way that we see international students. I mean, there's another really large cohort that we're not talking about here, which is the graduates, temporary graduates who have graduated from an Australian university and are now really in dire straits because they no longer have their university to fall back on, and they are really sort of unseen, I think, when we talk about international students. But there are just as many of them here as there are working holiday makers. So in this conversation around temporary migrants, I think we're not really seeing this very large cohort of people who have been in the community for a long time and continue to be in the community for a long time as graduates working as well. And when they lose work, the chance of them getting other jobs are obviously extremely slim, but they've invested hugely in what they see as a longer term path in Australia. And so I think that conversation really doesn't play into the narratives around international education, that people are here for a long time, often on these sort of different visas, and really contribute greatly to our community, to our workplaces, to our economy in terms of work contribution, not just contribution of fees. So I think that the conversation elsewhere in other countries has been around temporary migrants more broadly and recognising how important and valuable they are to these communities. And I think that international students are viewed somewhat differently in Australia and not necessarily part of that temporary migrant community, who often prop up a number of our industries. I think the hospitality industry would probably really struggle if we didn't have international students and other temporary migrants working in it. And I don't think that there is an acknowledgement of that really important role that's played in our workforce and other aspects of our community and economy.
Millie, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just on what Basina said. So I fit all the categories at the moment, I'd just say. Temporary graduate, I graduated in March, mid-March. And then I did my graduation in hospitality and tourism. So just like me, there's so many who are now entering a market which is crashing, and the competitiveness out there is unbelievable. Everyone is being told, oh, upskill yourself, but it can be so stressful for graduates, international students, people who are planning to come here, or they have already enrolled but they have to stay in their home country and study virtually. It's very, very complicated and very stressing for so many people, so many international students out there. So yeah, I think it's like if we start looking at each section one step at a time without forgetting about another section or a group, we can overcome all such issues. If we just start by looking at what are the challenges that international students who are outside of Australia, but they're enrolled in an Australian universities, what is their feedback? A general feedback from there would be, I am missing out in that in-class experience, but I'm still paying that complete tuition fee that I would have in here. In fact, just recently, I'm not sure if it's from Australian University or somewhere else, I just came across this post on social media where a student has been charged $70 or $80 extra for student experience, and their class is actually happening virtually. And it's little things like that which makes international students, is my position, financial, mental, social, being considered or not when such decisions are made, or when I'm handed a bill like that. So that's one thing from international perspective. I think I'll come back to Vicky's question. So initially, when the corona outbreak happened, the immediate lockdown and everything, and when JobKeeper was announced, nothing was announced for international students and temporary migrants at that point. At that moment, yes, a lot of international students were feeling stranded. They were feeling, are we gonna be included in this or not? They had the feeling of exclusion. But we and many universities and student bodies like ourselves have been lobbying with different governments, their universities. And the good thing is lots of universities provided support, grocery, rent, and whatnot. There are local, state, and federal government providing different kind of support. There were study clusters who announced packages, care packages, and there's still a lot of study clusters doing. But again, Victoria, let's say Victoria, for example, a general sentiment among international students in Victoria is fearing of being homeless. And it's just, we're just going through a roller coaster. We did something good, but we are again lost. Like, where are we heading? We would do again something good, hopefully soon. Support these international students in Victoria, NSW. It's the uncertainty which makes difficult for everyone to understand what's going to happen. And it's just the uncertainty is one of the main reasons for that mental health impact and the stress and the worry.
Thanks, Millie. And I think that, you know, that fear. We've touched a little bit on the mental health aspects of what's going on for people who are in this situation. And I'm just wanting to know whether in the sort of a determined advocacy that we are all involved in, to what extent we think that further evidence is needed, and to what extent we need to be collaborating more in order to have the impact that we're after. So the role of evidence and the role of advocacy, what would you be saying we need to do more over the next period in light of so many experiences, Melanie, you know, and the understanding that that's at the heart, really the human face of this is extraordinary, isn't it? And you know, every time you speak to somebody, you'll carry that in your heart, actually, the fear of what frightened they are, but how do we cut through with that? Comment on that.
I just very quickly say that the hashtag "End This Together" has been going around ever since the COVID-19 breakout. We have been doing some good, but I'd also say that we can very strongly practice what we are preaching. So yes, we have a lot of room for development. And if we are actually in this together, if we actually consider what the person next to me is going through and what the person sitting next to that person is going through, we would be able to come through that. At this point, especially for students in Victoria, I think they need immense support. especially when it comes to their rent and accommodation. I know that the Study Victoria, Study Melbourne, they're doing very good workshops and programs to help prepare them for a job. But from here, students are not able to see if they would be getting a job anytime soon. And in such uncertain situations, everyone is looking for immediate solutions. That future is not providing them anything immediate, and what they need is some immediate relief, immediate support, immediate actions. So I think just having a view from students what in general they want to see immediately would probably guide us.
Jo, do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think Millie's point really pertinent here, and certainly for Victoria, the uncertainty, was always there around what the longer term trajectory looked like for students, and particularly those students who are graduating or set to graduate very soon. And then we have now again the immediate challenge with stage 4 restrictions and not having clarity around when things could shift for the better for students. I think the challenge, and Millie said it rightly, universities are responding in the way that they can. I suppose from my perspective, I'd like to see a more joined up approach, because there's amazing work happening across the sectors, but also community groups as well. So I think there's an opportunity, to sort of harness and leverage the capacity, because, everyone's responding in the best way that they can. But I think a more joined up approach, particularly what's happening in Victoria at the moment, it would set us up, I think, to respond to more of those immediate concerns and challenges that students in Victoria are facing, but also start sort of hopefully being able to lift our head above water and plan for what's coming next and beyond, I think, because, we've obviously got, as Millie said, we've got students who are offshore at the moment, and how do we continue to support them? How do we continue to support our current students and those completing as well? So I think there's, some short-term opportunities there for us to better join up, I think. But I think we've also got to start turning our minds to what the sort of future looks like in the next 12 months.
Nadine, yeah.
Just picking up on your question specifically, Cass, about an evidence base, I think we need to continue doing that. I think it is critical. And, we know that there are particular population groups that are suffering more as a result of COVID-19, that are more marginalised, that are not able, for a multitude of reasons, access the support that they need to be safe and healthy in the short and then the longer term recovery. And I think the international student cohort need to be considered as one of those. And again, going back to some of the key points I made, I think there is ongoing work to do around the narrative around international students and the diversity of this cohort and the particular experiences. And we could frame that as taking a human rights approach or a human rights lens. What are the experiences of this group? Let's not make any assumptions. How do we counter some of the assumptions, some of which are negative, but not all. I think there is also in the broader Australian community, there's just some misunderstandings about who make up the international student cohort and exactly what the current context looks like for them. And I think that narrative is really important. And, there's a couple of articles that have come out recently, and I noticed and read very briefly the one in The Conversation. There's some fantastic voices that are really prominent of international students in that I actually think point to experiences pre-COVID. And we know that that's the case for a whole range of population groups that have experienced marginalisation pre-COVID. It's just exacerbated or magnified. And the last thing I would say is this an opportunity to reframe the narrative and how we understand temporary migration in Australia's broader migration program? And my comment about about systemic racism or structural racism is really a question. What does this say? Does this point to issues around more structural or systemic racism? And I think that's more about government's response to supporting particular cohorts. Does it, doesn't it? How do we reframe the narrative around our migration program, which is also significantly impacted in the current context and will be for some time?
And I just note that ACOSS is jointly advocating with, for example, the Federation of Ethnic Community Councils for a comprehensive anti-racism strategy to be funded and supported across the Australian community. And now more than ever, we see it's so important. I've got also a question from Andrew Scottford, which has just disappeared on me, but if I recall, Andrew, it was you wanted to know what can we do to strengthen the communications to students, because it's obviously quite complex about how to get help, how we're going with that communication for students, and what more could be done and by whom.
So I'll take on that. Hi, Andrew. Thank you for your question. When it comes to spreading messages, we all play an important role. So my dad once explained this to me. This one person sends a message to these 3 people, and now these 3 people would send a message to other 3 people. I think that's a chain we need to continue and make sure that everyone knows what's happening and what's not happening, just in case they are not aware about something on their own. So when it comes to spreading messages, that's what we need to keep doing. Just stay in touch, tell that's happening. Did you know that? Did you not? And just ensure that we are growing together. Like, no one is actually left behind. Anytime else, like now more than ever, we need that we stick together and we are actually growing together, professionally and personally. And we are not trying to bring anyone else down. Instead of entering in that competitive market, tearing each other apart, we have to stick together and help each other reach that common goal. At the end, we all want to be happy, successful, stable.
Oh, it's so true. You know, it's so true. And I think your voice, I hope there's some journos in this webinar right now listening to, and will be reporting and you know, strengthening your voice out there on this. And I think that is part of it, Nanine. You know, visibility, voice is everything. And I'm aware, of course, that for many students there's sometimes a sense of not being safe to speak up. And we've got to sort of tackle that culture that can build up around fear when you're on a temporary visa too. I've just got a question here from Caitlin Carpenter as well, where she's asking, can universities provide more transparency about the demographics of who are the international students and the sort of the makeup of the university population? I'm aware, of course, we're not just talking about universities, we're talking about, you know, a lot of different educational institutions. And there was another question about to what extent do we know the number of international students who are enrolled, who are still in Australia, and those who are still enrolled but not outside of Australia now? What's the mix between those two? Take that question.
Well, I'm happy to pick up a part of it. I can certainly answer the last bit first about from the Group of Eight's perspective. We think we've got about 75,000 students onshore and around 35,000 students collectively still offshore. And I think actually in the chat somebody put up the data that had come out recently from the department on the global figure. Just noting for those reading the chat, that global figure is all international students. And of course, my frame of reference is university students. And Cass makes a very good point, because there was an earlier question about vocational education and training as well. And so obviously we can't ignore that, and that has to be part of the broader debate that we're having. In terms of the transparency around the demographics of international students, that data, or at least that information, is fairly transparently available, certainly through Australian Education International, AEI, in terms of the cohorts and the breakdown. And then certainly within our own universities, so I just need to unpick the question a bit. There's the demographics of the international student, and then there's how much of the student body are international students. So I'm not sure, and I'm looking here at probably either Joanne or Bassina to help me out here, but my understanding is that universities certainly, again, in an economics context, in their annual reporting would report fee revenue, and that would be international students and domestic. So that may help in that, if that's the question you're asking, Caitlin. And then in terms of the actual demographics, I'm not sure if universities individually actually report publicly on the demographics of their student cohort, but I'd probably defer, just in case I'm wrong on that last point, to Joanne or Bassina.
I might make a comment, really add to your points, Vicky. For the most part, we make that information available as you described. I won't commit to saying that we do it by sort of demographic and country of origin at this point. I'd need to check on that. But I think there's a step before, you know, in terms of raising the visibility of the profile of the international cohort, which is, I suppose, ensuring there's a better understanding about how our education system works in Australia. There's a lot of misconceptions around, you know, taking international students above domestic students. So I think there's, and it sort of comes back to Nadine's point about, you know, the narrative and making sure that we've got the narrative right around that, because I think there's a lack of understanding about how the system actually works in reality. But I think it's really important. I think it's important. I think, you know, and I think we have to call on domestic students as well to have a voice in all of this, because they also benefit from the engagement they have with international students, the diversity of the classroom experience, etc. So I think that's really important. Of course, our academic colleagues as well, who can really lend a voice to this as well.
Jo, it's a great answer, and Millie as well. I know we're going to need to start to wrap up, and I'll hand back to you, Vicky, in just one moment, but I can't help myself. I'm just going to ask each of you to very quickly say if there were 3 things that concerned people on this call could help to help right now, what would they be? Who wants to go first? Bassina?
Okay, sure. I think obviously the first is continuing to advocate for ongoing support from the Commonwealth Government, whether it's in the form of special benefits or job seeker, job keepers, so long as there is that sense of ongoing support. I know there are a lot of international students here. I would say look after each other. And I think that one of the things that came out really strongly from our research last year was that the place where international students get information, or the place that they go when they have problems at work or in housing, is other international students. It's not necessarily service providers or universities or government organisations. And so we really need to think about getting information out through those networks and using those networks to give students a sense of support, and there are people to talk to, and they're your peers and your friends, and really recognising that that's where students are going for help. So I would say that is a really important point as well. And so final one is just, I think we need to confront issues around race and discrimination, because I think that they are lurking under the surface, and we need to have that conversation as well.
Thanks. Jo, anything from you to add on that one?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, I think it's, you know, really important that, you know, and Vicky alluded to this earlier around, you know, the economics around international students, and it's important to send that message to government, but I think it's equally important to send the message about what they mean to our communities. I mean, I just have to think what our, you know, Carlton, Parkville area looks like at Melbourne at now. The campus is not physically opened, but I imagine the perimeter of that campus is very, very quiet. You know, not just with the restrictions, but, you know, given, you know, the life and energy that our international students bring to our community, I think it's really important that we equally, you know, create visibility around that.
Millie or Nadine, anything you'd like to say before we start to wrap up?
I'll pop in. Just 3 things from my end would be stay connected, check in on your peers, just ask them, are you okay? Second would be, if you see any kind of racism or discrimination, stand up for yourself, stand up for your peers. silence is not the answer. And third would be take care of yourself, just take care of your mental health. Always focus on that.
And I think just two things, I'd echo what everybody else has said, but once again, I would say, this is probably a long overdue opportunity to reframe a narrative around international students, just to kind of reiterate that point. And you've made a few more comments, Joe, just in terms of the contribution to community, social, cultural, economic. We need to do better at getting that message out. And the second thing I would say is we need to invest in culturally appropriate mental health support. We are hearing that loud and clear. So the mental health support is great, those initiatives around that, but it needs to be culturally accessible mental health support, and the best people to drive that are young people themselves.
So, Cass, if I can just pick up and wrap up from my perspective, throughout this webinar, we've had, I think, at one point over 100 people listening to us, and that is a really important collective who can help us in the advocacy. What I find working in the university sector and at the Group of 8 in particular is that a lot of our messaging falls on deaf ears, and we need a coalition of the willing. And this is separate to the advocacy, because that's my bread and butter and that's your bread and butter as ACOSS and many of the agencies that are here. But we need multiple voices out there talking about the benefit of international education to this country. And what's really important, I think, to understand is this is not a new thing. We've been taking international students since the Colombo Plan, and we wouldn't be the country we are now if we didn't have that input and impact from our international students, many of whom have stayed on and made an incredible contribution both to our own country, many of whom have gone back and are in the region and are in some cases running those countries. And so there is a fantastic story there, which I say ad nauseum, but we need other voices in the mix. So mine is one thing, and that is that sort of the joined up advocacy is very important, but just the more diverse voices we can get out there talking about that value, not just the economic value as we've said today, but about the social value, the cultural value, the soft diplomacy, the political value. There's so many aspects to it. I think that's a really important outcome. If we could achieve that, would be great. It's a long game, but nothing is achieved if we just sort of think that we can do this in a short time.
Thank you, Vicky. Thank you to the Group of 8 for the partnership to bring this together. I know from the 100+ people who have been involved in this webinar this morning, very warmly thank each of you, Joanne and Millie and Basina and Nadine, for your presentations today, but more importantly for all the incredible work that you're doing. And to quote you, Millie, let us stay connected, let us look after ourselves, and let's not be silent. Today is all about speaking up, and I want to thank all of you for everything you're doing, and we will continue to do our advocacy. Thank you to all those who helped to organise this, Danny in particular, to Edwina and others behind the scenes, and to all the participants. And there's a lot of great sharing that's been going on in this chat. The community power is at its best and sometimes in crises. We've seen that, and this, as you say, Nadine, is a chance for us to really break through with a very different story and a different outcome for international students who are warmly welcome in Australia. So thank you, Millie. Thanks, everybody.